I like to.
Mhm. Yeah, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about this and we're going to go forward, and then I'm going to have to make amends for the fact that I am so distracted this last 3 or 4 days. I don't even want to waste your time telling you how and why. I thought I might be getting COVID. I had brain fog, and it was after getting my shot, my booster shot late Tuesday. So yeah, sometimes that's almost as bad as the effect of the disease. No, of course it's not. But yeah, so I was a little out of it, and I apologize because it's the first lecture I've done since I got my booster, and I forgot to record the first 3 slides. So I will do that on my own after we're finished here.
Did you get them on the same day?
Uh,
Because I did, and I was
no,
foggy.
I'd already had my flu shot about 2 weeks before.
Oh.
Okay, so here we go. This is one I'm going to cut from the study list so we can do it quickly, and then I will go back and continue on. I'll answer your questions, and then I will go ahead and do the other three. There's no point in starting all over again. So if you miss the first 2 must-knows, then that might be a good thing to stick around after I finish the last new slide on the list for today. Okay, so this is not on the test. It's Matisse. You can cross it off. The Joy of Living. I love this painting too. Yeah, it's in Paris. It's a scene of human joy. I mean, look how far ahead of time he was, his time. It was illegal, absolutely illegal to have same-sex relationships in almost every country in the world in 1906. He didn't care. He knew plenty of people who, I used to have a phrase. I remember I'd say this to some of my uncles. You must have all known people who just think it's evil and it's a sin to allow any kind of same-sex relation beyond friendships. How does someone else's happiness harm you? And they couldn't answer that question. So that's the attitude.
That's right.
That's the attitude that Matisse, who was a total humanist, had. I said that with the last slide, so you don't need to be taking notes again. But if you miss that, you will want to stick around. We're getting some background. It always happens. Hang on, I forget. How do we do this? I forget how to do the mute. There we go. Yeah. Okay. All right. So you don't have to write this, but you should be, right, focusing on the fact that this is an indication, just for your own information, of his humanitarian attitude, or humanist, you could even say. He's showing men, women together, men separately, women separately, enjoying life and loving what they're doing or the person they're with. Here they're dancing, right, in a circle, further away from us. And then we have 2 women here and 2 women here who are just obviously close and enjoying each other's company and affection. And then we have a man and a woman here, obviously very much, we'll say, probably in love. But look at the colors here. Yeah, you were talking about the colors. Blue grass. Well, they say that it's in Kentucky, but I've been to Kentucky. No, the grass ain't blue. It's not realistic. And look at the wonderful colors in the tree, sort of implied overarching tree branches and tree tops. But the colors are not realistic. Even in the fall, you don't usually get this kind of intensity of red, and you certainly wouldn't see them alternating patches of red, yellow, orange, and green in the treetops. And then the horizon has blue and purple on it, which you might think of as you have to write this as a kind of atmospheric perspective, but it really isn't. It's just the bold, vivid, unreal colors that all expressionist paintings had. Okay, so since that's not on the list, I just want to make sure that this is, yeah, there we go, is recording. Okay, finally. All right, let's move on to the next must-know. Is Picasso. Okay, and here we go again. Some of you may have heard this. I've even seen it in TV shows and movies with people mispronouncing Picasso's name. Picasso is Picasso, or if you're from the Midwest, you don't say it that way. You say Pablo Picasso. That's how my aunt called him. This is a very important slide. I won't cut it from the study list. Well, I might. Let's just say for now, we don't know. One of these 2 slides is very likely, very probable, the 2 Picasso slides, to be on the final. Okay. And I might cut one of them, but for now, we'll just say either one could be. So take good notes. Picasso, the Old Guitarist. That's the title. The Old Guitarist, 1903. Picasso is considered the first abstract painter by many historians. Just say he's the first famous abstract painter in Western art. You always have to say it that way, in European art, but his influence was worldwide. There's no question. He became the most famous painter of the 20th century. Nobody argues with that. Even Matisse wouldn't argue with that, as much as they were rivals. But to me, it's a meaningless, comparison to say one was greater than the other. One was more famous in terms of his recognition. Picasso was so well known that his image, photos of him and videos of him and movies or documentaries with him in them, and lectures that he would give with large audiences when he traveled around the world to talk about his art and his beliefs. He was a household name. There's no question. He was the most famous painter of the 20th century. So that's one fact. Another is that he didn't start out being abstract. Most painters don't. He started out learning in Spain. He was from Spain. That's not obvious. As my aunt called him, the Spanish guy with the big eyes, which is both facts are true. He was born in Spain and he studied art first in Spain, but he moved to Paris at a young age. So when he moved to Paris, he hadn't started his abstract period. This piece is, to say, the most famous of his blue period. Literally 2 words, just like they sound. This is from Picasso's blue period, which was in the early 1900s when he had moved to Paris. He used the color blue to state, guess what? It's his own version of Expressionism. So you could call this Spanish Expressionism or Picasso's version of Expressionism, because blue, of course, has pretty specific meanings in Western culture, at least. Sadness, depression. There's a reason why the form of music that's such an American iconic creation, right, of African American culture, blues, which I was lucky enough to actually hear famous Southern blues guitarists in the 60s when they were still playing live in nightclubs in Chicago that my dad took me to. Yeah, blues, the blues, and or the blue mood. You've heard that phrase. Blue, right, is a word that implies, and a color, I should say, more so, that applies sadness or depression. So this guitarist is homeless, if that's not obvious. He was an actual person that Picasso had seen on the streets of Barcelona, which is the main city he spent his time in. It was his favorite city. And if you ever go to Spain, you'll see why. It's a beautiful city. So he was sort of, you could say, both French and Spanish. He became a citizen, I believe, of France, as well as, of course, being born in Spain. He was a citizen of Spain first. So he had studios and homes in both countries, Spain and France. But when he was in Paris, he looked back on many tragic scenes he saw in the poor sections of Barcelona, and just spelled like it sounds, Barcelona, Barcelona. It was his main, he wasn't born there, but he moved there at a young age and lived on and off the rest of his life in that city. So when he was, studying art, before he came up, in other words, with his new abstract style, which is the next slide we're going to see. Before that, he was more of an expressionist, because that's really what we're looking at. The color blue is not realistic. Of course it's not. It's not meant to be. But it does evoke a strong emotion that the artist is feeling, which is sadness and even somewhat depression at all the poverty and suffering he saw in the streets of Barcelona's a big city. It's like 5 million people or something. So he saw a lot of suffering in the city of Barcelona as he was studying art, and it stayed with him after he moved to Paris. And that's where he was when he painted this. By the way, here's another world-class painting. You have to write this. That's at the Art Institute of Chicago. They've owned it since shortly after he painted it. You have to go there to see the original. So it's a homeless, elderly, very obviously, well, if it's not obvious, the man was ill and near death, right, when he was begging on the streets of a big city, specifically Barcelona, Spain, for money. And that's the comment that the state of mind, of course, that the artist is conveying is his sadness and depression at seeing this suffering as he walked through the streets of his hometown. So he did several years, for several years, I'm sorry, he painted these blue period paintings, but this is the most famous one. So that's the whole meaning. It's three masses, you could say, if we want to break it down, the largest being the guitarist, then the guitar, and perhaps the curb, but depends on what. Then there's a wall behind him, so you could say the wall is the second largest, and the guitar is the third largest. Okay, the rhythm is obvious with the human body parts, arms, hands, legs, feet, and then of course it is not obviously, but I would argue mostly stable. Look at the right angle of his head and neck. He can barely hold his head up, and his torso. However, you'd have to say the limbs, obviously the legs, although this leg is at a right angle, one of his legs and both of his arms are dynamic. So it's a mixture. Of course, the guitar is dynamic. So it's both. There's just thin outline. What little bit you can see is really only on the guitar and maybe, yeah, on his legs, but not so much. Yeah, there is, I guess, if you go up close, there is some outline here on his arms, hands, and legs, not so much on his head. There is modeling here, obviously, on all his body parts and his clothing, not the guitar. It's obviously a cool color on everything, the background, the man, except for the guitar. The guitar is warm. And then we have for space, overlapping, and foreshortening. There's foreshortening, I'd say, on his legs, and certainly on this one section of the curb here. And then we have balance. Is it? I think it is, because the way his head projects out and one of his 2 feet, and then this arm and, hand, and the other foot, I'd say it's roughly balanced, even though there's more space between his shoulders on the left than the right. So if you think of it as slightly unbalanced toward the right, I wouldn't argue, but definitely top to bottom, it's balanced. And then we have simulated texture. It's implied here. It's not meant to be super sharp and realistic. The modeling is realistic, but expressionist paintings, whether Spanish, French, or any other country's artists, expressionist painting, you don't worry about realistic simulated texture. And there's no distortion of proportion here. Okay, this next one is probably the most influential painting you're going to see in this week's lectures. Again, a high probability, I would say, of being on the final. It's also Picasso, and the title is French, so I have to say it slowly and spell it for you twice. Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. That means the women of Avignon, which is actually a street in Barcelona. People think it's a city in France that has the same name. It's not. It's a scene he saw when he lived in Barcelona. Les Demoiselles, the first 2 words for the ladies is first word L-E-S, and then the second is D-E-M-O-I-S-E-L-L-E-S, de apostrophe, and then Avignon, A-V-I-G-N-O-N, 1907. So this is the first Cubist painting. That makes it world importance, is worldwide. What does that mean? Okay, well, it's on your list of definitions, second from the last, right? So here we go. Cubism was an early style of abstract art created by Picasso, an early style of abstract art created by Picasso, in which the main objects are distorted by breaking them down into geometric shapes. I'll say that last part again. In which the main objects are distorted by breaking them down into geometric shapes. That's exactly what we see here with these women. Their bodies have, he even called it shards, like as though broken glass is what, the shape of the elbows, especially their elbows, but also, their overall torsos and even arms and legs. And this woman's breast, at least the one we can see here, and hers perhaps. So the figures are not meant to be realistic. This is another step, or more than one step, away from, again, those rules of Renaissance realism I've been talking about. He broke the rules even more so than most expressionists. This is not at all expressionist. It is his own style. He created, and he coined the word too, Cubism. Now, he gave credit where credit's due, and that's an important point to make, because there was, when I was studying art at UC Berkeley 40 some 50 year whatever it was, 40 45 years ago, there was some criticism that, oh well, he was expropriating African sculpture. Not exactly. Yes and no. In other words, yes, he was inspired by African sculpture, but he more than gave credit. He promoted that and helped the French public be aware of the beauty and uniqueness of African sculpture going back hundreds of years. And some say without that, there might not be the Museum of African Art, which is a great museum of art from hundreds of years of African history in Paris. That museum opened while he was still alive. Now he wasn't, officially associated with it, but he popularized and educated the public about the unique and original features of African sculpture, and directly credited that mode of art, that medium, with inspiring him to create Cubism. For instance, this mask. No question, he looked at some. He owned many pieces of African art, and he bought them legally. He did not expropriate them from the original owners. And then you see here, this woman's face also has somewhat of an African sculpture or African mask. Whoops, went too far. Sorry. So that's an important point. It's not a minor detail that he was inspired to create this whole style of Cubism, at least on some of the details, particularly on the faces, which look mask, or you could say mask-like faces of some figures in his Cubist paintings, which is a style he used throughout his career. He would go away from it for a while, for a few years, and come back to it. So it was his first abstract style, and he is often considered the first abstract painter, period, because this is one of the first abstract styles, and he clearly created it. It was his. There was a debate before. Oh, was Braque the other guy that's often associated with him? He was friends, rivals, also with, living in Paris, same time. He also did this style painting, but you can just say nobody now disputes it. It was a Picasso invention. Okay, but what's the other part of the meaning is, what is this scene? It's the window of a brothel, 5 prostitutes in the window of a brothel that he saw in Barcelona. Would be, of course, they call that, quote, red light district, right? Where it was legal in that section of many other cities throughout Europe, that's true, but it was then in Barcelona in this one neighborhood. Now, there's a debate about this too. Did he frequent that place? In which case he'd have to be considered somewhat hypocritical, because he said his reason for choosing this subject and portraying these 5 women in the window of a brothel is to show their defiance in the face of a type of living, let's just say, some people would say profession, whatever, a lifestyle that they were forced into because of abuse or abandonment, right? Or not.
Also ill repute.
Yeah, well, I think that the odds are pretty good that that's what he meant. But, there were some who say, oh, he's just covering up, like, what we said about Rodin covering up for him being the aggressor in that relationship with his former assistant, Camille Claudel, with that piece, the sculpture of the kiss. But here's what we can say for sure about this piece, is that he was a, quote, communist, unquote. That's, the phrase, right? Literally a member, a card-carrying member of the Communist Party, who was always speaking out about what he saw as social injustice, including the concept that women had to sometimes sell their bodies in poor neighborhoods to survive. So the odds are probably greater that he really was trying to make a social statement here, rather than just remembering something that he had partaken of himself. There's a possibility both are true, though. As a young man, he didn't deny that he'd gone to brothels as a young man because it was legal. But whether this particular group of women were ones, these 5 women that he did, you could say, take advantage of or solicit or patronize, whatever word you want to use, or visit, or that he just saw them in a window and was upset how they were being forced into this profession. We don't know for sure, but the odds are probably pretty good that it was. By the time he painted it, it would be a statement of social criticism of good culture that would have made these women feel they didn't have any other choice in many cases, right, to survive, but to do this kind of work. Okay, so that's pretty much the whole meaning, except that when this was painted, it was roundly attacked by critics, you could imagine, who didn't understand it. And they said it was offensive, not the subject so much. So some of them did say that too, but the style of it. How dare you distort the, now here we got distortion of proportion on the bodies. Obviously the arms are out of proportion at the angles of the arms. And some would say the two faces, or certainly this one who's sitting with her back to us. I call that the Linda Blair effect. You don't know what I'm talking about unless you've seen the movie The Exorcist, where her head turns around while she's sitting. Anyway, whatever. You can't do that. It's physically impossible to be looking at us while your back is turned to us, unless, you know, obviously something happened in an accident and you're not alive anymore. So these are all living women he's portraying here. So it's unrealistic. It's meant to be. And yet some critics just attacked it viciously, saying it was offensive in more ways than one, particularly in the style of the distortion of proportions on these women's bodies. So that's our first of the elements we'll cover. Yes, there's a distortion of proportion here, no question, right? And that would be okay, with the individual body parts, particularly the arms, and in to some degree, at least the face or head even of this woman's body, and I would say this one's too, the two with the mask-like faces, are exaggerated, unrealistically large individual portions of their body. So there's distorted proportion or altered proportion. It's warm on the skin tones, of course, of these women. They're Spanish women, and there is a cool color to the curtain behind them, and on the fruit here that's sitting at the bottom, mostly, although that looks like perhaps a melon of some kind, so that's warm. And there's a little bit of warmth in the far left or section, I should say, of that. The lines here are bold. The lines are outlines, not everywhere, but where there are lines on at least parts of the bodies of almost all the figures, those are bold lines. There is some limited modeling, mostly only on this woman here, right? On her mask-like face and her breast. Other than that, there's not much. Some people think they see modeling on this woman's back, perhaps, but it's not realistic. There is no symmetric texture here. It's not meant to be. There's no even attempt to. It's maybe some people think it's implied, but I don't think that even, except possibly the curtain, which could be like satin or something. Maybe there's some implication of a shiny surface on that, but other than that, there's no, that's not realistic still though, so that's implied perhaps, but everything else is not even an implied symmetric texture. It is completely dynamic. There is not a straight line in it. The only techniques for space here are overlapping of the figures themselves over the background, right? And the rhythm is obvious with the arms, hands, legs, and heads, even if they're not all realistically portrayed. Is it balanced? I think so, because you've got two figures on this side, two on this side, and one in the middle. I would say roughly balanced left to right and top to bottom. So let's do one more, and then I'll stop for a few minutes to take questions, and then I'm going to go back and do the first two must-know slides that I forgot to record, so that it's all on one the video that you can, if you missed the first few, or you want to study, obviously, those slides that we covered before. I remembered when I hit record, which was after the Red Studio. So I'll go back and redo the Rodin and Red Studio slides at the end, but I'll take questions first. Okay, this is another must know, and I love this. There won't be a lot to say about it. The artist name is Marc, M-A-R-C. The Large Blue Horses. The title, just like it sounds, The Large Blue Horses, 1911. Marc was a German Jewish painter, and he was therefore a German expressionist. If it's not obvious, these are not real colors. Has anyone ever seen a blue horse? I don't think so, not in real life, maybe in a dream or in the movie. No, that was a green horse in Wizard of Oz, a horse of a different color. I think when they got into the city gates, Dorothy and her friends, they saw a horse of a different color, but it wasn't blue. So this is totally imaginary, of course. Totally dynamic composition and imaginative, and the colors are bold, vivid, unreal. The emotion here is the artist's love of animals. He loved animals, and horses were his favorite subject. Not only horses, he painted all kinds of animals in a natural setting, a beautiful natural setting. This looks like a tropical island, or is it? I mean, this sort of appears to be what, having been to the Caribbean, particularly all over Cuba, these palm trees, these tall, narrow palm trees, the kind that grow in the Caribbean, or at least in Cuba, that's the kind of trunk they have. So it's probably implied that those are tropical trees, probably palm trees, but it's not obvious. And then are these hills? Well, sort of, they look like, and then what happens here? Where does the landscape of the hills end and the clouds begin? We can't tell. We're not supposed to know. And so he was a member of the German Expressionist movement, and they were called, one of their names given by, in English, was the Blue Rider School. Well, that kind of fits, doesn't it? Because you could ride these horses if you could tame them. They are wild here, obviously, in this setting, though. He admired animals, both domestic and wild, and painted many images of animals in their natural setting. Not in a zoo. I don't think he ever went to a zoo to paint subjects. Okay, he loved animals in their wild or natural setting. All right, then we have the formal elements, and then we'll pause and I'll take some questions and then cap on the first 3 slides that I forgot to record. So I'll be on this video when you're ready to study for the final. Okay, wrapping it up. There is not a straight line in it. It's all dynamic. For space, all I see is overlapping. There aren't any horses in the background. Are these hills diminishing size? They are where they are. I don't, and you can't say that's atmospheric perspective. We can't tell. I mean, it looks sort of like a patch of blue sky, right? But we don't know that for sure. Obviously, the colors are cool on the horses and the 2 tree trunks, and warm on almost all of the background colors. There is modeling here now. This modeling is realistic. And I would say there's implied texture on the horse's manes, but that's about it. There's, maybe you could think of that as implied horse hair on their bodies, perhaps you could say, but I don't really see that. Just maybe the horse's manes are somewhat implied, but there's no realistic cement texture, even though there's strong realistic modeling. The largest mass would be the horse that's closest to us, then the one next to him, and then the one behind those 2. The only techniques for space are overlapping. I don't see foreshortening. There's no scientific perspective or vanishing point. And I already said there really isn't any atmospheric perspective. Are the proportions here? Yeah, I'd say they are. The horses are a little too rounded, a little too thick and heavy for what they would be. If they were wild horses, they wouldn't be this heavy, right? So he's exaggerating their muscles and their overall size of their main part of, maybe even on the legs, or you can't really see the legs very easily. So yes, a little bit of the legs here. So there's an exaggerated or altered, enlarged, if you want to say, proportions on the horse's bodies, not so much on their head and neck, but on the rest of their bodies. Okay, and then let's see, we have line. Yeah, I would say there's some, but it's minimal. There really is very little line, except on the back of this one part of the back of this horse here. I don't even see it on these palm trees. That's modeling. So there really is little to no outline, except maybe in this one section on the horse farthest away from us. Okay, and then we have, let's see, overlap. Oh, balance. Is it balanced? Yes, I think so. If you squint, the size of this horse's body and what we can see of the other 2 that overlap each other, roughly equal left to right. And we don't know if that's empty space. So there's colors, all the way up to the top of the painting, patches of color. And then down here we have, I'd say roughly a balance with the ground, right? That implies different kinds of vegetation. So I'd say it's balanced left to right and top to bottom. I think I've covered everything here. Okay, so we're going to stop the share. And I'm going to take questions if anyone has any questions about anything we just covered or anything else relating to this particular lecture or anything else. Well, we only have 2 more weeks left, and we've got a lot of new art to cover. So you do want to make sure that you can hopefully attend the actual live lectures, because then you can ask questions and follow along more clearly than you can when you're just watching a video. But all of these will be today's slides, the must-haves. If you joined us late, I did cut 1 slide from the list for today, and that's the second Matisse slide, The Joy of Living. You can cross that off. Okay, but I do want to do this. This is meant as a helpful heads up that I don't have, hang on, a few people still need to get, and you're getting it's getting down to the wire. Remember, final exams week, meaning beginning on the 12th, I can't accept any late work. Extra credit, yes, but not late work. There's too much else to grade. They've moved up our deadline to the week before New Year's for all the grades. It used to be the first week after New Year's to turn in all the grades from all our classes from every course at the JC. Okay, so I'm just gonna, this won't take very long, then I'll get to recapping with the slides from the beginning. Let's see. I think it's only on the second page. Here we go. It's only 3 or 4 people. Okay, I don't have from Megan McCann. I don't at the moment have either of the 2 midterms. But if there's some evidence, this is not my rule, this is the college rule, and particularly the art department's rule, of being out of town or incapacitated, it has to be some kind of written evidence of that, then you can do a makeup. So at least if you have such evidence, any of the names on this list, you can contact me. Yeah.
Okay. I don't have evidence of that, but I do have email evidence that I sent them to you.
Yeah, this is one of those issues. See, that's why I love teaching in-person classes so much more.
Right.
It happens so often. So that's easy to prove. So that won't be a problem, except that
Okay.
I don't have them in my inbox and I can't begin to guess why, but there's some glitch.
Strange.
So
Okay.
what I suggest for anyone in this is to resend, in your case, it's the 2 exams,
Yeah.
both to the AOL and the Santa Rosa JC website.
Okay.
And I'll confirm with you if I've got them. So obviously,
Okay.
you don't need to ask me to do that unless you want to put that in the tagline. And hopefully, if you can do that tonight, I can confirm by tomorrow that I got them. All right.
Definitely.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Of course. Now we're down to only, let's see, Brian Pollock, I didn't see your first midterm. And again, if you have evidence that you actually did it before the deadline, it'll be obvious in the email train. You can still send it to me and there'll be no points off. And then I have for, I don't have a paper, first research paper from Josu Sanchez, which is fine because there's no deadline for that, except the end of next week is the cutoff. And that's only 10 points off and you make that up with extra credit. So hopefully anyone who didn't do their research paper will still turn them in. And then I don't have from Ethan Thompson or Jack Walton the second midterm. And again, that just has to be some way of verifying that if you did it on time and you send it in, there should be an email trail that you can show me. I need to see that though, not just resend it, with a nothing accompanying it. Some evidence, screenshot of whatever the first time you sent it was. And if it was done, then I can count those. And then there's one more, I don't know if she's dropped, but Tamala Tablood, I never got a first paper or second midterm from. I'm just doing this as a way of hopefully prompting, anyone who I don't yet have for whatever reason, all of the assignments that we've done, which is 3 now, the research paper, first and second midterm, you want to follow up on that if you did do those. And of course, the paper, you could still, hopefully you're not, some of you who didn't, I think there was 2 people that haven't yet turned me, maybe it's 3 now, their research paper, I would not wait much longer, try to get it done this week and send it in hopefully in the next few days. So I can have time to grade it, get it back to you before the final. Okay, I am going to now do this, which I promised I would. So are there any questions, any other questions? Okay, because I want to make sure that we don't have, right, a problem with, well, first I have to go back to, let's see, yeah, here we go. I'm going to do the 2 Rodin slides. I won't talk about the little anecdote I had because that would be taking too much
The
time.
thinker.
Yeah, the thinker and the kiss. I'll redo those, just the meaning and the formal elements. Okay. All right. For those that either want to refresh your memory or later you'll want to watch these to study, or if you weren't here at the beginning, okay, because I didn't record them. My bad. All right. But to get screen share, we have to do this. Here we go. Right there. Whoops. Okay. Then we have one more and we enlarge it. And now can everybody see this? If you're still watching, those are okay. Yeah, it says you can see it. All right, so here we go. This is
Yes.
the must know from the week we did impressionism. So if you're looking at the syllabus, I'm not going to spell them because I want to save time. They're right there in front of you at the bottom of week 12. Week 12. I skipped these. That's why I'm doing them now. And this is being recorded. Let's just double check. Yes. Yep. Okay. So here we go. And we're having some background noise. So let's cut that out. Okay. All right. Here we go. This is The Thinker. You don't need to spell those words, right? Everyone knows how to write 2 words. The title, The Thinker. The artist's name, the sculptor is Rodin, R-O-D-I-N. And the date is 1889. Why are we still getting, something's not going on. Okay, we're getting background noise and that's distracting. So I'm trying to do this to where it won't be a problem. So those who are now listening and for the recording later on when you watch it, don't have that distraction. Okay, so what is this? Rodin is considered the greatest sculptor. Nobody argues it's in the last 150 years, at least Western sculptor, if you want to put it more accurately. He was ahead of his time in 2 ways. One is he developed a technique called malleable, to use your hands. You don't have to worry about the spelling, write it like it sounds. Malleable lumps of clay when it came to texture on his human figures in bronze. He was both a bronze and a marble sculptor. This only applies to his bronze sculpture. Of course, everyone knows this, that how does you make a bronze sculpture? You make it out of clay, of course, and then you cast it. So he did these malleable lumps of clay, and it's very unrealistic, and it's an exaggerated effect. He wanted to make people focus on the state of mind and of the thoughts and feelings of his subjects. They were always human figures. That's all he did his whole career. So he's not an abstract sculptor, but he's breaking the Renaissance rules of realism, because this isn't realistic submitted texture. No human body would have these kinds of lumps of clay unless there's something wrong with the person. They're very ill. Even the hair has that effect. You see that here? And certainly it's obvious on his leg and on his torso and his upper arm. So that's one of his 2 signature motifs that made him ahead of his time, that he didn't do strict realism on the cemented texture, but instead the technique he coined, malleable lumps of clay. Okay, the other was a rough base, just like it sounds. The bases on all his sculpture, both marble and bronze, had a rough texture. And there's a reason for that, which is that the symbolism is of the fact he used a rough base to symbolize the fact that we're all going to go back to the earth from which we came. In other words, we're all going to die. It's a short way of saying it. He's emphasizing human, or symbolizing human mortality. Not an upbeat thought, but it's a fact of life, right? And so what does the other part of the meaning of this, what is this man doing besides thinking? But what's he thinking about? He's thinking about the questions of life and death, or the meaning of life. He's deep in thought. And of course, some of you know this, but many of his sculptures, including this one, are found in sculpture gardens and museum courtyards, inside museums all around the world. He's that influential, including right here in San Francisco. If you didn't know that, the Legion of Honor, you walk right by this, a copy of this sculpture that he made and sold to that museum. So you can go see it and get extra credit if you want to go to that museum. Of course, twofer, you can take photos of the building, including the sculpture, right, as an architecture site, and then go inside and see more Rodin sculpture inside and show me the ticket. There would be 20 points extra credit right there. So it's very influential. But what was it carved for originally, or sculpted for? The gates of hell. That's a phrase that his patron, who hired him to do several sculptures, actually used to describe the gateway to some development that never got built. There's a debate. Was it going to be a housing project? Was it going to be a cemetery, or neither? It never got built, so we don't know. All we know is the gates he created in his studio. Of course, he had massive foundries, and kilns. I mean, of course he would. He was the world's most famous sculptor. So he had hundreds of people working for him, or over 100 anyway. So he created the cast iron gates, and then he made 2 of the most famous sculptures in the history of modern art, or this and the next must know, for that gate. he was asked to make figures that were going to be life-size human figures that would be attached to these cast iron gates, and they were huge. They were going to be, I don't know, 18 feet tall or something, and it never got assembled. But the gate itself, actually, parts of it still exist, but the figures are what's left over. And so they now are on display in what was once his home, and now it's called the Rodin Museum. That's where you see this here. Formal analysis, let's do it quickly. Completely cool color. There's no warm color here. Not realistic simulated texture, exaggerated or unrealistic with the malleable lumps of clay on the human figure. You could say maybe the rock, because the rocks do get kind of that rough texture. That might be realistic simulated texture. The rhythm is obvious. It's human body, arms, hands, legs. It's life size, so it's real space, but there is overlapping of the figure over the base. It is completely dynamic. There's nothing stable. It's balanced. It's an intact human body. There is exaggerated proportion clearly on the body, where he exaggerates the width of the arm here and the thickness of the leg, and the malleable lumps themselves are an exaggeration of a part of the human anatomy here. So there is exaggerated or altered proportion on his figures, but it's minor, it's slight. It's not exaggerated to the point where the human bodies he carved didn't look realistic. They just didn't have realistic symmetric textures, and they had exaggerated, slightly exaggerated proportion on some parts of their skin, I guess you say, or the outer body. Okay, then we have, I already said it's balanced. Oh, the lines are all carved line. Of course, it would have been carved line. And let's see, dynamic. Oh, modeling is just the shadows from the sun. Okay. I don't think I forgot anything, right? Yes. Okay. The next must know is The Kiss by Rodin. Rodin. Again, you already know spelling The Kiss. You all know how to spell those words. 1898. Also part of the group of figures he originally carved. What he carved, this is marble, so obviously he carved this for the gates of hell that were never built. And so this particular one has a dual meaning. This is a piece of marble sculpture which still has the rough base, symbolizing the fact that these two lovers are going to go to hell when they die. Well, that's the first part of the meaning. They're going to die and go back into the earth, but in this case, they are symbolic of two figures from Dante's Inferno. That's with a capital I. Yeah, I think you've all heard of that. I assume it's one of the most famous poems in the history of the world, right? Inferno was a poem written in the Middle Ages by the Italian poet Dante, and it's about hell. It's about who goes to hell and why. So this is an adulterous couple from that poem named Paolo. Don't worry about how it's spelled, just write it like it sounds. The man is Paolo, and the woman Francesca, both married to someone else. So that made them adulterous lovers, which they are engaging in, of course, the first stages of lovemaking, and that will cause them to be damned to hell when they die. They will go to one of the lower rungs of hell, because according to Dante, your behavior determined how low in hell you went. And they would go down near the bottom rung, because it's, according to the teaching of the Catholic Church, of course, one of the worst sins there is adultery. But it has a second meaning, which has to do with the way his thumb is raised, the man's thumb on here. This also is symbolic of the fact that Rodin himself had an adulterous affair with one of his assistants, a woman named Camille Claudel. Again, just write it like it sounds. Camille, first name, Claudel. She was an assistant in his studio who was 25 years younger than him. He was married, she wasn't, but by definition, if they had an affair, it was an adulterous affair. She resisted him for almost a year. He pursued her for many, many months. And finally she gave in, and they had about a 15-year-long affair. And he kept promising, of course, that he'd leave his wife to marry her, and he never did. So eventually they broke up, and she never quite got over it. She didn't ever marry or get involved with anyone else, but she did become a successful sculptor because she had learned so much by studying and working in his studio, and she had her own career and was quite successful. Camille Claudel was her name. There's a movie with that title, in fact, about that relationship. But the bottom line of the man's thumb being raised, it's supposed to be him saying, oh, well, at least I was reluctant when I started that affair, which is total BS. He was not reluctant. as I just said, everyone now knows he pursued her, even if he said it was the other way around or that it was mutual. That's not true. He was, of course, the person with the power, the influence, the fame, the wealth, and obviously what, a generation older than her. So he was the one that was the instigator. But here he's almost trying to cover up his guilt by saying, oh, well, at least my raised thumb indicates this is, in other words, partially a self-portrait of him and Camille. The last thing to say is that on the formal elements, let's do the formal, is that it was placed in the window of his own home upstairs where the light, sorry, no, actually it's downstairs. Yeah, the light hits it at a certain time of day when he wanted people to see the modeling the way he visualized it. So that is part of the technique here. Usually modeling is a side effect on sculpture, right, of the sun and just wherever it happens. But he actually placed the figures in this spot specifically so the modeling would have this effect. So there is modeling on it as he planned. There's obviously carved line on both the figures and the base. It is roughly balanced. This is two human figures, even though he's be taller than her if he stood up. If you squint, you see it's pretty much balanced. I would say certainly left to right. You can make the case that the base is wider at the bottom, so that would be unbalanced somewhat toward the bottom. The rhythm is obvious with the human body parts, arms, hands, legs, heads. It is mostly dynamic on her and stable on him. If you look carefully, he's sitting pretty much upright. His body primarily is stable. Hers is almost entirely dynamic. And then the base is somewhat a little curve at the top, but mostly stable. It's a cool white color, of course. The texture here is realistic because this is not malleable lumps of clay. Obviously, it can't be. It's carved marble. So the smooth skin textures and the textures on the hair are very realistic cemented textures. And then the largest mass would be him. That's a close call, perhaps her or the base. Depends on how you look at it. Would be the second largest. And then I guess she might be the smallest. The base looks slightly bigger or heavier. And there's no distortion or alteration of proportions here. Okay, I'm going to stop the share and now go to Matisse's The Red Studio, which is an extremely important slide. So it's very important that we do see that. And of course, I need to make sure you can see it. And to do that, we will do the screen share. This will be the last new must know for this week's, today's lecture. Okay. Here we go. This is a really important one. It's very high. I was telling people when I first showed it that it's such a high probability of being on the final that I would take extra careful notes. It's one of the most famous paintings in the history of modern art. It's our last must know for today's lecture, and it is The Red Studio, just like it sounds, 3 words, The Red Studio by Matisse, Matisse, 1911. Matisse was one of the founders of Expressionism. And Expressionism was a movement of French early 20th century painting, or you could say a movement of early 20th century French painting. It was started in France. Sorry, and when I say French, I misspoke. It started in France. I will repeat that. Sorry. Just do it slowly so you get it correct. Expressionism was a movement of early 20th century painting, which began in France. And Matisse was one of the first, or even just say founders. That's a simple way to say it. He was one of the founders of that movement. Which means what? He was a French expressionist. And that's our only definition for remaining to be given today, which is, you see there just in the middle of the last page on the list of terms to know. 3 main features of expressionism. Here they are. Number 1, bold, vivid, and dynamic compositions. Bold, vivid, and dynamic compositions. Number 2, vivid, bold, vivid, and unrealistic colors. So number 2. It doesn't matter. There's no order here, which you could write them either order. So the colors are bold, vivid, and unrealistic. You'll see how that works here in a minute when I describe the meaning. And then the third feature is the display of the artist's emotions. That's what makes it different than any movement before, and it is the reason for the name of the movement, expressionism. But now you need to write one more term, which is only about this slide, in case it's on the slide essay part of the final. Matisse was the founder of the French school of expressionism, and he had a name. He gave that movement a name, specifically a French name, Fauve, F, that's capital F-A-U-V-E, which is a word meaning wild beasts. So he called himself and his fellow French expressionists wild beasts, meaning not literally, of course, but that they behaved in a very wild and imaginative way, or just say they were rebels. They broke the rules of Renaissance realism in a bunch of different ways. So now let's see how the other part of the meaning applies to this painting. Red in this painting is symbolic of his emotion of passion. He wanted to convey that he loved what he did. When he was in a studio creating painting, he was also a sculptor, by the way. And there's some example of his sculpture right there. He was both a painter, he was more famous though as a painter and a sculptor. So whenever he was in his studio creating art, he was happy. He loved or had a passion for his work. So you could just say it's a color of passion, passion for his work. That's the emotional, right, statement, the artist's own feelings expressed in this. And then of course the color is obviously unrealistic. He didn't paint everything in the entire studio, all the furniture, the walls, everything except the individual paintings. This color red, that's meant to symbolize the emotional content, the artist, again, feeling of passion for his work. So that's your bold, vivid, and unreal color. And then the whole thing is dynamic and imaginative. Actually, it's, if I said bold compositions, it's, you don't have to write that. It's really just dynamic and imaginative compositions. These particular objects are not, let's now do the formal analysis, not lined up correctly in a realistic system. There would be, consistent vanishing point. There is no vanishing point. So let's do the space first on the formal elements. There is no vanishing point, and therefore it does not use scientific perspective. It does use, obviously, overlapping. All art does that, even cave paintings. And then foreshortening on the table, and to a lesser degree, I guess, on this chair. But not much else. Overlapping, diminishing size, of course, on the paintings farthest away from us, and foreshortening are the only techniques for space. But it's not realistic in that sense. And then these objects being painted, like this chair, this dresser, this grandfather clock, these what are those called? I can remember the stands, I guess, for the sculpture, and the table. Those, of course, are not realistic either. The whole thing is made to look like he slapped red paint over every square inch of his studio and all the furniture in it, which he didn't. So what you have is a mixture of the warm color for color, of course, on just everything except the actual individual works of art. Those are portrayed in realistic colors with a mixture of warm and cool. The cool here on this man's, and some of the white, and certainly on one of the two pieces of sculpture, two of the objects on the table here. The plate he designed or created from scratch in his own kiln. Right, he owned many, rooms. His studio wasn't just this one room, but this is where he did his painting mostly. That was created by him. That's a piece of ceramic. It's a plate, of course, with a human figure. So those are cool, as is the wine bottle here. And yet most of the rest of the room and the whole painting is almost entirely warm. Even on the paintings themselves is mostly warm, pinks and reds and oranges, orange colored. Okay, then we have bold outline or thin. You could see it either way. I was saying before, when I wasn't recording, that this looks to some people to be bold outline, but most of the objects have thin outlines. The clock, the table, the dresser, these two stands here, I would say they're mostly thin outline, possibly the chair, but I think their outlines almost all the same. therefore mostly thin. There is no semi-texture except implied on the wine glass and the wine bottle, an empty wine bottle used as a vase, of course, for those flowers. Those two objects have the only modeling in the whole painting. There's no modeling in the rest. There's almost none anywhere except on the one glass and on the neck of the wine bottle. Everything else is absent modeling, and there's no semi-texture, just implied. It's totally dynamic by definition, with the exception of the 4 paintings on the back wall. Yeah, you could say that. They all, of course, have frames that have right angles, but everything else in this pretty much is dynamic. Maybe the grandfather clock, yeah. But even the dresser here is at a slight angle here. And the sculpture, all of the works of art, other than the 4 on the back wall, are in a diagonal. So it's almost entirely dynamic. Is there exaggerated proportion? I would say there is. The table is larger than it would be if it was shoved toward the back wall. It would be much bigger than it would be compared in real life to a dresser here. So he's exaggerated the objects, the chair and the table closest to us. So there is a distorted scale. That's not proportion. If I said proportion, I misspoke. A scale of members between different objects. They're too large for the space in the room, the table and the chair. They're exaggerated. Okay, and then is it balanced? Not really. It's unbalanced toward the top because of all this empty space. And most people would say there's more objects, more art objects that he's displaying here on the left side of the room, so it's more unbalanced toward the left. And of course the rhythm is obvious with the flowers here and the paintings and the furniture. One last thing about the meeting, and then we'll call it a day. I'll stick around if there's still 1 or 2 more questions, is that he was a humanitarian. I mentioned this when I showed the slide before I wasn't recording, which is that he gave back a lot, and he donated much of his art, including some of his ceramics, plates and things, to the UN to help homeless families, particularly children, after World War II, because there were many millions of homeless people in Europe after World War II, of course, but also in Asia too, because of the Japanese invasions of China and other parts of Asia. So he was helping people who needed help, donating his work. And the final fact about the meeting is Matisse is considered one of the 2 greatest painters, if not artists, period, but certainly one of the 2 greatest painters of the 20th century, along with Picasso. They were friends and rivals both. At times they got angry with each other, but most of the time they respected each other's work. And so of the 2, though, the one that had the more humanitarian, style of relating to the world and giving back, literally giving some of the things he could have sold for a lot of money, thousands of dollars. Instead, they were auctioned to raise millions and millions of dollars. He created hundreds of these objects, these ceramic objects, to donate to the United Nations Fund to help homeless families after World War II. Okay, there we go. Stopping the share. Anybody have any questions that I didn't already answer that might have occurred to anyone in the last few minutes? Okay, so I'm going to see you guys on Wednesday. We'll finish early 20th century painting, and then we will have late 20th century painting next week. Very important subject, because we're spending 2 whole weeks on 20th century painting, and that tells you it's going to inevitably be at least 1, probably 2 slides from the last 2 weeks of this class of the painting slides on the final. Okay, one more time. Anybody have any questions? I'm glad I was able to catch the fact that I wasn't recording before. So now everything's on this one video that we needed to have, which I will be posting just like I always do, along with the Wednesday video on YouTube by 8 p.m. on Friday, if not sooner. Oh, by the way, everyone got the email. I posted the video of the lecture I gave during Thanksgiving break, also along with the one we did live on Monday. Both for last week's lectures are now on YouTube. Okay, you guys, see you on Wednesday. Bye.